My family spent quite a bit of time outside this summer at swimming pools, and I learned something kind of profound being at a lot of pools this summer. The shallow end of the pool is where all the noise is. The shallow end of the pool is where all the noise is. And man, let me tell you, when I started thinking about that, the shallow end of our political discourse is where all the noise is. The shallow end of conversations about religion is where all the noise is. The shallow end is where all the noise is. And this passage today is called the mini apocalypse of Mark. Like the rest of the chapter, I didn't even have it in me to read it to you. It gets scary. It's a monologue from Jesus. It's called the Olivet Dialogue, and he ends up talking about the moon turning to blood, Father turning against Son. It is some scary stuff. It gets into some thick weeds. And when you start talking about the end of the world, you want to talk about the shallow end of the pool? And all the noise. If you grew up in the 90s, or if you were alive in the 90s, if you were alive in the 2000s, you heard a lot of noise. Do you remember Y2K? Do you remember the two movies that came out that were like the same movie? Only you had Bruce Willis in one fighting an asteroid, and then you had Deep Impact. And of course, evangelical Christianity can't leave money on the table, so we came out with our own end of the world books, the Left Behind series. The shallow end of the pool, my friends. So let me ask you, this passage is about the apocalypse. It is about revelation, Greek word for revealing. Do you want to go deep? Are you willing to go just a little bit deeper? Where we're not going to talk about the rapture or the Antichrist, that's the shallow end of the pool. That even though your feet are on the ground, you've heard that before, you've watched the movie, you bought the ticket, in order to get into what Jesus is talking about, your feet might leave the ground a little bit. You're going a little deeper. So we're going to go a little bit deeper. That was your warning. And no one ran out just yet. The fulcrum, the center point of gravity of this passage mostly gets missed for a lot of modern Christians. Because for us, we're kind of text-based folks, or we're relation-based folks. You all knew about the whole thing with the fingers and the church and the steeple, open up the doors, see all the people. Trying to remind you that church is not the rafters, but us. And then there's folks, like those are the relational folks. And then there's some Christians where it's about the Bible, it's about the Word. For a Jew living in the time of Jesus, they had those. But the center of gravity for Jewish life at the time of Jesus was the temple. For one thing, it's like the physical aspect. You could physically feel it. Think about this for just a second. In the time of Jesus, if you lived in the time of Jesus, you were from Nazareth or from Bethlehem, all the towns you actually know. But if you're from that area, most of the buildings you saw, if you saw buildings, were one story. You might have seen a couple of two-story, maybe a third story, if you've been to Jerusalem. The temple is more equivalent to US Bank Stadium. Can you imagine the awe and wonder when a third-story building is shocking to you, to then see the stadium? That's just the physical presence, let alone the spiritual impact. In Minnesota, the churches are legion. Spiritual homes are separate, and we have the theology to back up. It's not about the building. Whole branches of Judaism at this time said the building is the only place God resides. In the Holy of Holies, behind the curtain, that's where God is. And if you haven't seen a third-story building, you can look at that building, you can look at the temple and say, that's where God's going to sit. It's the biggest building I've ever seen. It would be as if we took every church and put it into one, all your spiritual experience, the whole of who you thought where God could physically be is in one location. This is what you grew up looking at. This is home to you. That is where God was. It was holy and mystery and had splendor to it. And as you're on this once in a while trip to Jerusalem, you got to see it, and you're standing next to Jesus. This is somebody you loved and cared about, and you're like, hey, check out the scenery. And Jesus says, this thing isn't going to last, right? None of these stones are even going to be one on top of another. Let me tell you, if we had social media or if we had news like we have today back then, this is the story. This would be the only story anyone would know about Jesus. Prophet from Nazareth predicts the destruction of the temple after the weather. Because it would have been so radical. It would have been so jarring. It would have been full stop. We're not talking about this. We got to move on. It's that moment when all the oxygen gets sucked out of the room and no one knows what to say. I love it in the biblical text. He says this, and the next verse, after the end of the quotation, the next verse is, when they got to the Mount of Olives, because no one could say a thing after that. Everyone's like, did you just hear that? Wait, you talk to him. I'm not talking to him. You talk. You can't. He can't say that about the temple. We can't be doing this. We're going to get killed. I like the temple. It was pretty. I brought my kids there. When they finally get to him, when the disciples finally bring it up to him, he then goes in to what we call the small apocalypse of Mark. The whole rest of the chapter, I can show you my notes if you want to read them. It's heavy. And it can be scary. I think a lot of good horror movies could take, notes on what to do. I think some of them have. He makes a few proclamations in there that are clear references to passages in Daniel. But he also makes one startling claim in there that most Christians today roll off and would forget about. He says in that passage, in the chapter 13, everyone in this generation is going to see this come to pass. Jesus says that the stars will fall from the sky, that the sun will turn to blood, and that the moon will crash into the world. And Jesus says everyone here is going to see it happen. Well, we're all still here. So can we take this literally? I don't think so. Either Jesus is deceived, he's just plain wrong, or he's speaking in metaphor. And if you think about it as a metaphor, if you take in this passage and the fact that they just came out of the temple, and he starts talking about the passages from Daniel about the Son of Man being revealed, about nation against nation, and that one day all of this will pass. You finally start to hear what he's talking about. And the fact that everyone of this generation will see it. He's talking about how his death and resurrection is the ground that you can stand on. That the church in the generation after Jesus and for a couple of generations after Jesus are going to face serious suppression, oppression. They are going to feel like there is no way out. That they're not just in the deep end, they're in open water without a boat. How long can you tread water? Jesus is saying, when everything is flipped upside down, when your world has come crashing down, the one thing you can be sure of, because of Christ's death and resurrection, God has a ground for you to stand on. That's when we start seeing where the word apocalypse and revelation. So the apocalyptos is coming from the Greek. Revelation came from the Latin, which is the interpretation of revelation, of revealing. You reveal in this passage what's really going on. What is the value of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? So when have you... Oh, the last metaphor. I just want to say this because the whole sun, moon, and stars falling out of the sky, for us, we've seen enough sci-fi movies and we know about asteroids, so we've actually seen kind of like computer-generated images. For a time in which Jesus is living, that metaphor directly translates to what would the stars and the sun and the moon be used for? What were their purpose? Well, growing crops, but also navigation. You knew where you were in the world because of where the stars were in the sky. When have you, in your life, have you ever had a time where you had no idea what the next right step is? Where your whole world came crashing down in a moment? Where you could not feel any ground under your feet? Where the water has gone over your head time and time again? Buddy of mine just went to therapy. He had one session. He said it changed his life. One session. I was like, I didn't even know you were going to therapy. He said, I heard you talk about it so much, I figured I might as well. I was like, all right. So he goes to therapy, tells the therapist, what are you doing here? You seem pretty balanced. He's like, well, I'm a good dad. I'm a good partner. I'm good at my job. I'm a good son. But I figure if I was actually good at these things, I'd be great by now. I'm 35. Therapist took one look at him and says, you just named, you are a partner to your husband, you are a dad to your kids, you are a son to your parents, you are a worker for your job. You are a lot of roles to other people, but take those roles away, who are you? He said it was nothing but waterworks, because he didn't know if there was really a person underneath all that. Revelation. That's an apocalypse. That's an end of the world. How many of us have experienced a death that shook us? Maybe it was it can even be one of those quote unquote expected deaths, let alone an unexpected death. A revelation of what is the real truth. Who are you without that person? What has every person who's ever gone through a divorce had to figure out? If your marriage was at any kind of a length, who are you without that partner? Maybe you're running towards that question. You can't wait to find out. Which is also what brings me to like some of the sheer honor I would have for any member of the LGBTQI plus community to have discovered, to come out and to find that part of yourself a revealing both to you and then to see the revelation happen to your community around you. Jesus invites us, no matter what revelation we are going through, whatever chapter in our lives that shake us, no matter how deep the waters we have swam in, that in his life, death, and resurrection, we actually do have a ground to stand on. For the person who's coming out, God loves you so much that God would rather die than be God without you. To the person experiencing a death, God stands outside of time, saying death has no end, is not the end. It is the opening of a new chapter that God stands on the other side of. You're going through a divorce. Your partner wasn't the center of your life. God always was. You are not the roles that you have fulfilled in other people's lives, in other circumstances, in other institutions. Your value comes from who you are in God's sight, and that alone defines your value. We may have swam out into the deep waters, but that's where the fun really is in swimming. See, if all you are called to, if all you have ever felt of religion is going up to your knees in the waters, my friends, you'll just end up cold. When the storm comes, I invite you to learn how to swim, to be baptized, to be covered, to be steeped in it. This, my friends, is the true revelation of your life and mine. So, going forward, how do you face a tomorrow when you don't know who you are? When the losses have piled up, when the bills seem too high, when the closet doors seem too strong, when the government seems like it's about to shut everything down for you. The vision that Jesus portrays is not one of violence. It's not of armed resistance. It is one where God loves you. And from that center, then looking out. So how do you see the world? Is the world trying to oppress you? What is your vision going forward? That's what our closing hymn, that's what the next hymn is. That's what the hymn after the sermon is all about. Is now that you have found your center, what next? I've always heard that, like, Christian faith, I believe in, deathbed confessions. That God is abundant in mercy at any moment, including our last. But if you're here, chances are you're not in your last moments. Thanks be to God. But with whatever time you have left, what is the vision that you are faced with? What are you choosing to see? What do you ask God to see in this moment? And so, I invite you to stand as you're able. We'll join in our closing. Be thou my vision.